portfolio. Chapter 17. First, an aim that really at this point probably should strike you as fairly redundant. The contrast between VAR and tracking error. So VAR is the maximum dollar earnings or loss potential associated with a given level of statistical confidence over a given period of time. So that should be familiar, particularly in the sense that we've got the two design decisions that need to be made, statistical confidence and the horizon. Whereas tracking error is defined here as the standard deviation of excess returns, and Litterman, like Grinold, has it as the standard deviation of what we would call the active return, the difference between the portfolio returns and the benchmark returns. So we have VAR and then tracking error. So here is Litterman's decomposition, return of the portfolio. Here is just he just decomposes the difference between the portfolio and the benchmark. And then he's got if we parse the portfolio returns in those two components that are additive, see how this is really the active return here, and then this is just the return of the benchmark. Then we can take the variance of that addition in our usual fashion, right? The variance of this component plus the variance of this component plus 2 times the covariance. And if you're wondering why aren't the weights in there, well, that's because it's a 1-to-1, so they're essentially ones. And so, again, I said these were qualitative, so we're asked to describe risk planning, including objectives. So 1, the risk plan should set expected return and volatility goals for relevant time period and establish mileposts which would let oversight bodies recognize points of success or failure. And also the risk plan should use scenario analysis to explore those kinds of factors that could cause the business plan to fail. 2, the risk plan should define points of success and failure. So examples that he cites are return on levels of return on equity or returns on risk capital. 3, the risk plan should deploy risk capital to meet the organization's objectives. And 4, a risk plan should help the organization define the bright line between those events that are merely disappointing and those that inflict serious damage. And then 5 is the risk plan should identify critical dependencies that exist inside and outside the organization. The plan should describe the nature of the responses to be followed if there are breakdowns in such dependencies. And in terms of participants, an effective risk plan requires the active involvement of the organization's most senior leadership. So that's very thematic. And we're asked to describe risk budgeting. So the risk budgeting, which he also calls the asset allocation, should quantify the vision of the plan. Once a plan is put into place, a formal budgeting process should exist to express exactly how risk capital will be allocated such that the organization's strategic vision will be realized. And risk budgeting must incorporate mathematical models. So risk monitoring has a role in internal control environment, and variance monitoring is cited as a basic financial control tool. And he has a term, risk consciousness. And the sources of risk consciousness are the banks that lend to investors, the board of investment clients, senior management, investors and plan sponsors, and investors themselves, expected to have a first-hand knowledge about their investment choices. He also makes reference to a risk management unit. This is similar to a concept in Dowd, this separate risk unit, which gathers, monitors, analyzes, and distributes risk data to managers in order to better understand and control risk, helps the organization to develop a disciplined process and framework to identify and address risk topics, and the risk management unit should be actively involved in setting and implementing the risk agenda and related initiatives. Also, it should watch trends. It should be a catalyst for the discussion of risk-related matters. And it should represent a node of managerial convergence. It should help ensure that transactions are authorized with management and client expectations. With portfolio managers and senior management, the risk management unit identifies and develops risk measurement and performance attribution analytical tools. This includes the backtesting of models and the proactive research into model risk. And it should develop an inventory of quality risk data and methodologies. And finally, the risk management unit establishes risk reporting and performance attribution systems to portfolio managers and senior management. And the risk management unit should not manage risk, which is the responsibility of the individual portfolio managers, but rather measure risk for use by those with a vested interest in the process. So really cast in the context of a staff function. How does describe how risk monitoring confirms that investment activities are consistent with expectations? So risk monitoring is principally concerned with whether investment activities are behaving as expected. The importance of liquidity considerations. Since a portfolio's liquidity profile can change dramatically during difficult market environments, tools that measure portfolio liquidity are an essential element of the stress analysis. And then we have objectives of performance measurement, which he cites are four. One, determine whether a manager generates consistent excess risk-adjusted performance versus the benchmark. Two, to determine whether a manager generates superior risk-adjusted performance versus a peer group. Three, to determine whether the returns achieved are sufficient to compensate for the risk assumed in cost-benefit terms. And four, to provide a basis for identifying those managers whose processes generate high-quality excess risk-adjusted returns. And then the common features of a performance management framework include comparison of performance with expectations, return attribution, metrics like the Sharpe and information ratio, and comparison with benchmark portfolios and peer groups. So then if we break out those four tools, we have the comparison of performance with expectation, where tool number one is the green zone. And this should be reminds me of the Basel back test for market risk. So we're comparing the actual results to target. Two, attribution of returns. A commonly used tool to measure the quality of returns is performance attribution. This technique attributes the sources of returns to individual securities and are common factors. One format of attribution, commonly referred to as variance analysis, shows the contribution to overall performance for each security in the portfolio. And then tool 3 would include the Sharpe and information ratios, or metrics like that. They have weaknesses. They may require data that may not be available. But they have strengths. They can be used to measure relative performance versus the competition, so peer group comparison. They test whether the managers generate sufficient excess returns to compensate for the risk assumed, and they can be applied both at the portfolio level as well as at individual sectors. And then tool 4, alpha versus the benchmark. So this is the regression of excess returns of the fund against the excess returns of the benchmark. Notice this term excess here. That refers to returns above the risk-free rate. So typically, we don't want we want to regress the betas or the sensitivities against the common factors or excess returns. So we typically that little term there, excess, can be significant in practice.